And just as you're doing that, to just be clear that the recording has started, and I'll keep it rolling. I don't intend to edit the recording of this afternoon because, frankly, I think it probably be only you or your colleagues that want to look back at it. So I'm not intending to put this out more generally. So I will simply upload it at the end of the session so that you can access it if you wish. Okay, I'm going to hope that you've had enough time to do that. Probably the most time consuming part of that is the putting the title in. Oh, somebody's sending me a message. Done. Perfect. Diolch. At least I know we can march on. Well, again, it's really lovely to see you this afternoon. For those of you, I think I know everybody, but I'm Catherine McMahon, and this is the first of two sessions. I've tried to run one at this time in the day, knowing that for some of you, it's best to access during the day. But I'm repeating this next week on the 18th at a sort of staff meeting time, so that if that's any use to any of your colleagues, if you found it useful and you want to recommend it to somebody else, or colleagues, I'm running it again. It'll be exactly the same, but just at a different time. I'm going to try and do that more and more in the future. So just to clarify then, a little starter for 5. On a scale of Grover, how are you feeling this afternoon? You might want to put a number in the chat, or you might just want to have a look and think, oh, yeah, I'm definitely a 6. I'm already overwhelmed. Or I've achieved something fantastic with somebody this morning, so I'm a 2. Or I'm a bit, I don't know, I'm just middling. I'm neither here nor there. We've got a lot of 5s. Okay. Oh. I think as our colleague Claire on the call said earlier, it already feels like we've been doing this weeks since Christmas. So to make this worth your while, taking time out of your day for the next hour or so, this is what we're going to aim to have a go at. These were the success criteria that I was aiming at when I put this session together. So in this session, we will look briefly at what's known as the tiered approach to vocabulary. And I would have no surprise if this is already very familiar to you, but at least we're looking at consistent messages here across our team and other teams that will be looking at vocabulary. I hope that by the time you leave me this afternoon, you'll have a even further developed knowledge of some vocabulary development activities, and I'm going to share with you a few simple resources and ideas that you might use in the classroom. I hope that you all managed to catch hold of the email that I sent out suggesting that if you brought a text along that you might be using with your children in the next few days or weeks, you could try and, as the session goes along, try and put some of these ideas to the test with the text in mind to try and save you a little bit of time. So you'll have that to go away with if you've managed to do that. But more than anything, I hope you just feel confident that the materials that I'm sharing and the ideas this afternoon, you feel comfortable to go away with and either share with colleagues or just try to, further strengthen what you're doing in your own classroom with some of these ideas. So those are the aims for the afternoon, really. And as ever, all of the PL that comes from the AS now starts with this slide somewhere. you know, you're all at different stages in your teaching career. You all have different expertise. So the idea is that you will all hopefully get, as I will, get something out of this session, either brand new information that is new to you, that fits with your practice, that you think you can take away, or you'll come across certainly things that we talk about this afternoon that are not brand new at all to you, that are you're really familiar with, but that might just be a reminder that can enhance your practice and make you feel, actually, I do know quite a lot about this already, and I am on the right lines, and we are doing this with our students. Or it might be that you come away from today thinking, actually, I'm so experienced. There's very little that's new information here today. But what I can do, safe in the content of today, that it might help me to support another member of staff in my school, or maybe an NQT, or maybe if you're working with students in your school, there are materials here. So hopefully something here for everybody. So our session this afternoon, what I thought is sort of briefly to focus on why, you know, why are you here probably, and why did I decide probably over nearly 2 years ago now that I wanted to do something from my position in the team and across our team actually to focus on vocabulary. We're going to spend a little bit of time just thinking about, when we're talking about children knowing meanings of words, what are we aiming for there? What does that actually mean, that knowing a word, just briefly? And then much of the session will be exploring a model that is advocated by particularly the Education Endowment Foundation and one of their chief officers there, a gentleman called Alex Quigley, and a model which is the select your vocabulary, explain the vocabulary, explore that vocabulary, and then provide opportunities to consolidate. So it's quite a simple model, but that's our focus for today. And as I said, hopefully, you know, if you feel if you're in the mood and it suits your purposes, then as we go through, just a little bit of time during the session to try out some of the activities with the text that you hopefully have brought along. Okay. What I should also say is that at the end of this session, what I'll do is I'll upload a PDF of these slides into the chat for you. And what you'll be able to see is, as we go through the session, wherever I recommend a resource or some reading, there'll be links on the slide that you'll then be able to access from the PDF that will take you to all of the resources. So hopefully there's nothing that we talk about this afternoon that you can't then access afterwards. But again, you all know where I am. Feel free to email me if we miss anything. But so it was certainly probably a couple of years ago, when you were all battling with lockdown and bubbles in school, and where as a team we were forced into a position of not working directly and practically in schools, that I spent a bit of my time doing a lot of research around vocabulary. And I came across fairly recently a tweet from Rob Smith. Well, I'm sure you may know that Rob Smith is the creator behind the powerhouse behind the Literacy Shed. And he was tweeting about some work that he was doing with some children in the classroom. And I just thought it summed up really what it looks like when it's really good. So he's talking here about discussing a text and considering a number of factors about that text, about the importance of children having background knowledge to understand the text, and focusing on vocabulary. He talks about, before reading Oceans Meet the Sky by the Fan Brothers, I shared some images of the ocean with a class of Year 1 and Year 2. They discussed what they saw, they recorded the relevant ideas on a whiteboard. These 5 and 6-year-olds are able to describe the things they could see in the pictures. Features such as horizon, and I'm thinking this is not vocabulary the children brought to the lesson by any means, but as a teacher, he had decided he needed the children to have that vocabulary. So horizon added by him on each of the images that he shared with the children. A short activity. that preempt the reading that they were doing with the text. So this was before they read the story When the Ocean Meets the Sky. So they were then able to use the language that they'd looked at from pictures, and they were importantly able to start to use the word horizon when they were going through the book and when they were describing what was going on through the books. So as he says here, if they read the calm sea stretched towards the horizon, they had all that lovely 5 minutes of talk and looking at images, and the text, the picture book themselves to help them really understand that word horizon. And I kind of think that just really summed up what we're talking about here. The teacher making a specific decision to explicitly focus on the meaning of a word that is not only going to help the children with their comprehension for a particular text, but can then be transferred across a range of contexts in their reading and beyond their reading to help them with that wider understanding. And really, that's what we're aiming for here. This sits very nicely with what Estin say, and I'm sure you'll be familiar in one way or another with the document that came out in March 2021, particularly if you lead literacy in your school. The English language and English language and literacy in settings and primary schools was a kind of a thematic report that came from Estin back during lockdown, where they're reporting on what the best practice is with regards to teaching of English and literacy, and a huge meaty document, but some really interesting findings, particularly around vocabulary. And you can see here they said that what's important when you're thinking about developing children's vocabulary in primary is that they should be immersed in those language-rich learning environments. That staff should have really high expectations about children's vocabulary, and they should be clear about what their role is in developing that. That there should be a balance, a combination of planned, explicit teaching of vocabulary, as well as those more informal, incidental opportunities that you might jump on as a practitioner. But also that developing learners' vocabulary should think really carefully about the numbers of words that children know, but not just that, but how well they know it. So that's one of the reasons why we're going to focus on what does it mean to know a word. So I think it's interesting to start with what Estin say. But again, just if you are particularly interested in vocabulary, you might be doing some research in your school. It might be some kind of inquiry project that you're engaged with, or you might today might just wet your whistle to know a little bit more about where the research base is for what we're talking about today. So on this slide, the Google link takes you to a set of slides that were part of a professional learning series that actually our team provided last year called Working with Words. Which details really the research base. So, for example, at Oxford University, a survey of teachers in England particularly, looking at why closing the word gap matters. They interviewed a huge number of teachers, and their research found that many teachers right through the primary phase were very concerned about the range of vocabulary that children are coming into school with and developing in school, and their knowledge of that vocabulary and their ability to be able to use vocabulary to develop not only their reading skills, but their well-being and their self-esteem and their confidence as learners, and the impact it has right across the curriculum. So I won't go through this now. As I say, if you're interested, that set of slides, there is also a little YouTube video, it's about 15 minutes long, that talks you through it, but it's there if you're interested. But I will talk about one particular resource that I did look at in quite a lot of detail, and you may well be familiar with the Education Endowment Foundation. This is a foundation where a huge number of consultants and experts in education look very closely at the research base around what is best practice, with particular emphasis on our vulnerable learners. and they produce a series of reports around literacy and guidance documents around literacy. And as you can see on this slide, their early years guidance for best practice for literacy, particularly for vulnerable learners, on the left-hand side of the slide there, of their recommendations for best practice for early years, they particularly focus on the importance of explicitly extending children's vocabulary. Now, again, that's not news, but it's interesting that it's really explicit. That's not just about exposing children to quality language. It's about explicitly extending that vocabulary, both for oracy in particular. It then goes on in the orange recommendation there, which is one of the key recommendations for Key Stage 1, of course, with England terms here. They also focus on the importance of explicit and implicit focus on vocabulary, the importance of planning for the teaching of vocabulary and not just focusing on those incidental opportunities, but also on the importance of adults, teachers and other practitioners modelling and extending vocabulary specifically for reading comprehension. And this continues into Key Stage 2. So again, such a strong strand that the Education Endowment Foundation identify that for Key Stage 2 pupils, there's a really important need to continue to extend, to focus on vocabulary that helps pupils with their expressive and receptive vocabulary. So again, all of these sources reminding us of why this is so important. And the Estin document goes on to give a little bit more detail about what it looks like when it's good. And our session today is going to focus on really particularly that explicit teaching of vocabulary. So we're not talking about implicit approaches and that necessarily that breadth of a vocabulary rich day, week, year in a primary school. We are very specifically focusing on quite a small area with an eye to taking it away and doing it really well. So Estin say in highly effective schools, teachers use research-informed approaches, such as the ones that I've referred to, but such as teaching words that are not part of children's everyday conversations and reading. So looking for that vocabulary that extends them beyond where they already are. The importance of explaining word meanings, not just leaving it to the children to find out, but as adults, we're explaining meanings to them so that they're really clear on the nuances of particular words and why particularly words do the job that they do, and making connections with what they already know. It talks about providing authentic opportunities to expose children to that language, and in particularly we're talking about in connection with their reading. They talk about in the report here looking at raising interest of and interest in special characteristics of words, you know, how words are really juicy, and having an interest in words ourselves. But particularly they focus on morphology and etymology. Morphology being parts of words, the kinds of things that we might particularly make reference to in spelling when we're looking at prefixes and suffixes and how those affect the spellings of words, but how that affects the meaning of words, and also where those root words, the roots of the words come from, etymology, you know, which language they originated from, what did that mean, and how that can help us to really start to understand and remember what words mean. It also, in the final bullet there, interestingly references the work of Beck, McKeown and Kuchen, which was the starting point for my research as well, where where they set out in their work, Bringing Words to Life, how we can help children to learn the kinds of strategies and the kinds of teaching that we're going to talk about today, to help them to use that kind of way of working more independently as they go through the primary school. So apologies for sort of front loading with the theory, but this is just setting our context really. because this session is particularly around how are we helping explicitly teach vocabulary so that this aids children's reading. When we're talking about aiding children's reading, we are talking about them, the breadth of their reading knowledge and comprehension. And I just briefly mention that Scarborough's reading rope here. When we're talking about children as readers, this is a really, I love this model as a visual to demonstrate what we're talking about, the breadth, the range of knowledge and skills that children have to be able to have in order to be comprehending and fluent readers. And you may already be very familiar with this model. It's used very widely, including by the Education Endowment Foundation and ESTIM. To be a reader, that as this model shows us, that the children need to have two broad strands of knowledge and understanding. They need that word recognition strand. So as it says on the model, they need to be able to see words on sight. They need to be able to decode using their phonics strategies in particular, and they also have to have a phonological awareness. They have to understand that words come in parts, whether that be syllables or individual phonemes. But importantly, in order to develop that breadth of comprehension, they also need all the other strands that tie together, intertwine in this rope for children to be good readers. They need to have background knowledge of the subject content that they're reading about. They need to have really good, deep knowledge of the vocabulary that they are decoding or seeing on sight. They need to know about the language structures of the text, so they need to know about the punctuation and how the grammar works and how words connect in sentences. They also need to have those verbal reasoning skills to be able, when they need to be able to read between the lines or to understand text that doesn't have a literal meaning, such as metaphor, personification, and so on. But they also need to have that body of literary knowledge that you're constantly working on about the types of text and features of text and how text is organized on the page. And all of this knowledge and all of these skills together help them to access and understand and get meaning from text. So when we're thinking about choosing text and helping children and teaching explicitly vocabulary, that sits around alongside all of those strands from the reading note. So if I could just ask you for a moment, I hope you can all see that, and it's large enough on the screen for you. Can I ask you to just take a moment and to read that text? Okay, so you might actually be familiar with this. This is an extract from one of the old paper copies of the Year 2 National Reading Test from a number of years ago, which obviously we've gone online now and it's adaptive, but this was one of the old copies. If we were to look at the complexity of this text for a Year 2 child as a reader in relation to those strands that I've just mentioned, I would argue that the background knowledge that children would need to bring to this text to really have good, real deep understanding of this text, perhaps in terms of background knowledge, they'd need to have be familiar with the idea of turtles, and that turtles actually come from eggs as young turtles. Because it doesn't tell us in the text here, would it help them to know that many turtles actually are found in warm countries? And that often they are hatched by their mother into sand by a beach, by the sea. So some of that information is not here in the text, but by knowing that background knowledge, as we know, it's so important that the children have this background knowledge to draw on. Reading is very much a knowledge collection alongside skills. I would argue that in this particular example, the language structures that we would want children to bring to this would include things like knowing how ellipses are used in that third paragraph, knowing what that means, having come across that and understanding that particular type of language structure. We really need them to know about the speech marks at the end of the text also, and what that means to be able to interpret the text. In terms of verbal reasoning, I think actually the children would really need to be able to infer perhaps that this, from the image and the text, is taking place on a beach with that reference to the sea. Do they know that? Can they infer that from the text? And the literary knowledge that they might need from this text is actually that it's narrative. Even though it's about turtles, it's not really a non-fiction text. It's a narrative text. It's telling a story. And so it's imaginative, even though they have to bring some perhaps factual knowledge to it. So I say this really in the context for the fact that we're actually focusing on that final strand of the rope, if you like, vocabulary. And I'm just going to ask you for a moment to reflect on, would you say that there is any vocabulary in this text that you feel might cause a problem, individual words that you think might cause a problem for children if they were coming to this text cold? And can I just invite you to just perhaps pop them in the chat if you could? That would be great. Thank you. Yeah, okay, so we've got dozens, except I think dozens is a really interesting, it's a really interesting one. Because actually it's almost used as idiomatic language in the English language. It doesn't necessarily mean 12 and 12 and 12. It just means lots in English now, doesn't it? So scrabbled, yeah, I would say that might be one that would they might struggle with. Thank you. Okay, so whilst again, I just make the point that although we're talking particularly today about vocabulary, it can't really be seen in isolation, and there's that range of comprehension strategies that the children need to bring to the text. But we are focusing particularly today on knowledge of English vocabulary in this case. And just a reference to the why as well, our new curriculum, we have our statements of what matters, those receptive skills, understanding languages, and it tells us explicitly in our curriculum in progression steps 1 to 3 there, and particularly I've just screenshot that thread that focuses on vocabulary. So in progression step 1, we want children will be experimenting with vocabulary that you have taught them or that they have incidentally come across. Progression step 2, they're developing through their listening and the reading. So again, very firmly what we're focusing on today. And into progression step 3, where they're reading not only to understand for their reading, but then to use that vocabulary to build that wider knowledge base. And similarly, although we're focusing on reading today, the impacts on their writing, where our pupils, we want them to start to begin to use appropriate language to talk about particular events. We want them to be able to communicate using an increasingly varied and precise vocabulary. Again, that word precise, about really knowing word meanings well. And into progression step 3, where starting to make choices, using idiomatic language, and so on. So feeding on into the writing as well. Okay, and I seem to have that twice, apologies. So I would say, not that I'm advocating that you go out and buy books, but if you were particularly interested in the teaching of vocabulary, the book I would suggest would be the second edition, Bringing Words to Life There, by Isabel Beck, Margaret McKeon and Linda Kuchen. A lot of subsequent educational research around vocabulary comes back to this particular body of work, where they talk about a robust approach to vocabulary means directly explaining meanings of words with thought-provoking, playful, interactive follow-up. And I was particularly interested in that directly explaining. This is not leaving it to children to find out for themselves. This is not providing children with dictionaries and go and find out. This is, in particular, using the language that the children already have to help them understand new words. So here's our starting point today. What does it mean to fully know a word? What Beck et al. Suggested is that there are kind of four parts to knowing a word, if you like, a sequence. You're either at the beginning here and you don't know the word, you've never seen the word, never heard the word, you do not know the word. Or perhaps you've seen or heard the word in passing, but you have really, you perhaps think, I've heard it in a context, but I really still don't really know what that means. Or it might be that you're at number 3 there, that you know something about it, you're kind of in the ballpark, you've got an idea in relation to a particular context, but you probably couldn't explain it to somebody else or use it confidently in your writing, perhaps. And then finally, to know a word fully would be, if you saw it in your reading, you would feel confident that you understand it, that you would be able to understand it in that context, but also that you would perhaps be able to explain it to somebody else and use it in a different context effectively. So as a little starter for 10 again, can I ask you in the chat, pandiculate? Is this, can you just pop in the chat, is this a 1, a 2, a 3 or a 4 for you? Pandiculate. I'm relieved. It was a 1 for me. That's why I chose it. Okay, so I think most of you have had a chance. Oh, do you know, great. So pandiculate. Let me give you a context then that might help you a little bit. Pandiculate. She was shocked at the noise that came from the man as he pandiculated in the bedroom. Now, you know, adult audience might not use that one with the children, but this is just for us now. If I tell you that the word pandiculate actually means to have a good stretch and a yawn at the same time, so it's nothing rude. Pandiculate, to have a stretch and a yawn at the same time. So I don't know whether you're interested, but I think it's fascinating to think about the etymology of the words. Actually, the word pandiculate originates from the Latin. So in Latin, pandere is to stretch. And if you think about that, pandere, it's that same root as comes from the word expand, where you know that something is getting bigger and stretching. So to pandiculate comes from that original meaning of pandere, to expand. So if you are pandiculating, you're stretching and yawning and you're perhaps expanding, perhaps your lungs and your body while you do it. I thought that was fascinating, but that's how sad I am. I wonder if you had any clue from the word, from the parts of the word, that it was going to be a verb rather than, for example, an adjective or a noun. I think as experienced users of the language, you probably just worked that out automatically. Pan made me think of pandemic. Yeah, interesting. Absolutely. Yeah. Um, the So by thinking about, in this case, we're looking at the etymology to help us understand it. Perhaps you might feel the same way about surreptitious. Again, have a go at that. Is it a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4? Yeah, I think I'm kind of somewhere between the 2 and the 3 there, which is again and why I chose this one. It's the kind of word you might hear in conversation and then think, oh, please don't pick on me because I've kind of heard that word, but I really couldn't put my finger on it. I wouldn't be able to use it confidently in a context. So for surreptitious, um, isn't actually an adjective, and it means to keep something secret, perhaps particularly with something that might not be approved of, that might be a little bit naughty or a little bit cheeky. So to say that something is surreptitious, as you can see here, low wages were supplemented by the surreptitious removal of items from the stock cupboard. Again, the context gives you a little bit of an idea, but knowing the word, knowing that it's about that kind of being secretive, something you probably shouldn't be doing, but that you are doing, helps with that understanding. So really knowing a word, again, it's just a fleeting reference to it, to perhaps focus on the importance for children as well. I think I know, I used to do a lot of work in my classroom around using synonyms, and I used to say quite often that words are this, and another way of saying it is this, and another word that means the same is this. But actually, I think what we're going to be talking about a little bit is the nuances and being really clear about specific meanings of individual words and helping children to be as confident as possible that they really know a word. And that's our focus for today. Okay. So, as I mentioned right at the start, a lot of the ideas were kicked off for me with a gentleman called Alex Quigley, who is a consultant at the Education Endowment Foundation, but he also has a blog, and he writes as the Confident Teacher, which I think I came across originally on Twitter. He first created a blog back in 2021, and the link to that blog again is on the slide. So if you choose to download the PDF later, you can read that article. But it really intrigued me. He was talking about 3 pillars of vocabulary teaching: that you need to be explicit, you also need to provide incidental vocabulary learning, and to cultivate this interest, this consciousness, this engagement with words and interest in words, which kind of mirrors what the Education Endowment Foundation said, but also what Estin say. And I guess in our new curriculum, this is what we would be aiming for. You may be familiar with his book, Closing the Vocabulary Gap, which he then went on to publish at about the same time. So a really good read to exemplify a lot of his ideas. And what we're focusing on today is just that number 1 in particular, that explicit vocabulary teaching. Because if we can get that right, if we can do that little and often and plan to do that with regards to vocabulary, with the text that we're using with our children for our language teaching, or even for our guided reading, we start to chip away at that vast array of vocabulary that we would like our children to be able to know well for their reading and for wider. So he talks about the select, explain, explore, consolidate model. And this is starting with, when you've got a text that you're going to be reading with the children and perhaps looking at over a little period of time, you want to select the words that you're going to focus on, because there are just so many words that we want our children to know deeply and to know and understand well, that we've got to start somewhere. So it's about selecting the words that are going to do the best job for us. And this, as Beck et al. In their Bringing Words to Life book, and Quigley as well, would suggest, is choosing words that are going to support the children in really comprehending and understanding that chosen text best. What are the words that are going to help them to get the most full understanding of the text that they're reading? Thinking about perhaps particularly as children older through the school and get higher up, thinking about those words that are really closely associated with the plot, or with the theme of the story in particular, or with the mood that's trying to be created through that text. We're in the business of selecting just those really important words and trying to select the ones that are going to have the biggest impact, that are likely to be encountered by the children, not only in that book, but in a range of other texts that they're going to come across, so that by learning these one or two words for your text, it has the most impact. By choosing words that help them to know and understand other words that are similar, so that it's again, it's making that range that they have extended, and perhaps ones that they're not familiar with through their normal oral language, the kinds of words that perhaps are most likely to be come across in the reading, that they perhaps are not words that they would use day in, day out in their oral language. You know, I've given you the example of pandiculate. It might not be one that you're going to come across very often in your reading, but neither is it one that you're going to come across in your oral work. But if I knew that we were going to be using the text where pandiculate is key to some of the action in the story, it would be a good one to choose for that. So in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen there, I've put a picture of Goldilocks, because often selecting the right vocabulary is selecting those Goldilocks word I've seen referenced in a lot of my reading. Those words that are not too hard, not too easy, just right to have maximum impact on their comprehension of the text, but also to be able to use in a variety of contexts. So here we are to the 3 tiers model for vocabulary that I mentioned in the success criteria. This model, again, I'm sure will have come across it in other places. It's used by L-Clan with their training. It's used by the COMET team in our region, where they support with speech and language intervention, and I'll talk a little bit more about them later on. It's a model that's used very widely. So the idea that we can perhaps categorize vocabulary into 3 tiers. So that first tier would be the kinds of words that we would expect children to have from their day-to-day interactions and their talk. Words that they shouldn't really struggle with, particularly when they come across them in their reading, that they won't struggle with the meaning of those words. And then we have tier 2, those kinds of words that they might see, they might know from their oral work, they might have heard these words and they might use them in context orally, but if they came across them in their reading, they might not have a really good understanding and comprehension of those words in their reading. And they could be any word class, it could be adjectives, it could be verbs, and so on. That it's the realm of words. And they're words that will crop up in many contexts in their kind of academic life, if you like, in their reading life through the primary school. And then they have the tier 3 words, those words that are probably what we might call subject-specific, topic-specific vocabulary, that might be very specific to, for example, a science topic, might be very specific to a PE focus, but are perhaps not words that the children are going to come across regularly across a range of contexts, particularly in their reading. And again, the link on the slide there takes you to some reference to the use of this in some of their literacy guidance. So Alex Quigley talks about, selecting vocabulary, and Beck et al. Talk about focusing on, if you're selecting words, focus on tier 2. That kind of vocabulary that the children are going to come across in that text, but are then going to be supporting their comprehension when they come across that vocabulary in a range of subsequent reading activity, the words that they are going to come across quite often. A resource that I would particularly recommend, because I know that a number of schools in our region have engaged in training with them, either through the comic team or separately, is a resource called Word Aware. I'll mention this again at the end of the session. In the Word Aware training and resources, they talk about the 3 tiers, but they use the language of step-on words, Goldilocks words, and anchor words, which really they're talking about exactly the same things. Those step-on words that you would expect children to know and understand the meaning of them if they came across them in their reading. Goldilocks words, as we said, not too hard, not too easy, but just right to help them with comprehending that text and to be able to transfer them. And those anchor words that are really about anchoring subject knowledge in particular topic areas. So, as a way of getting into this, perhaps if we look at an example of a text and how we might go about that select process, and we'll have a go with this text, and then if I can give you a couple of minutes, if you have managed to bring a text along, you could perhaps look at an extract from that or the whole thing if you're with younger children, and we'll do that job again. So, if we were selecting vocabulary that we think might challenge, so any kind of vocabulary in this text that might challenge children if they came across it, perhaps if you were doing shared reading with your class, with a group, with this text. So I'm just going to ask you, perhaps if you've got a piece of paper with you or a post-it note, you might just want to jot those down for a moment. So ones that they might be able to decode them, but do they have a really good understanding of what that word means? Do they have a really good knowledge of that vocabulary? So not so much can they decode it, but do they have a really good comprehension of what that word means? Okay. If I won't ask you to feedback on that particularly. When I was taking this extract, I chose that Lost Happy Endings because I think it's a really rich picture book, but I think some of the language in here is quite challenging for pupils, and although they may be able to read the words, I think the really deep understanding of some of this vocabulary might not be there for all children, so I thought it was a useful one to start. When I went through, these were some of the words that I highlighted. Certainly, probably, depending on the group that you're thinking of, there might be others. But these might cause some challenges with regards to understanding these words. So, having identified quite a wide collection there, if we were then to just narrow that down to think about selecting those tier 2 vocabulary, those words that are not just specific to this context, that would likely be cropping up in a variety of reading contexts in general. So that might be more useful in a range. Can I ask you to just look again at your list and perhaps narrow that down to those tier 2 words, those words that the children would, the knowledge of those words would be transferred to more texts. And again, I mean, certainly you may have particular groups in mind. I was thinking broadly about the fact that I think the word drift has a very particular meaning, and it's a word that you're likely to come across in other reading and in other contexts, in other curriculum areas even, where a knowledge of what drifting really looks like and really means, rather than just moving, how it's moving, would be useful. So I've slimmed down my original list there. And if I just show you on the next slide to get a feel for, so you can see that the words that I originally identified have narrowed it down a bit, and I've sort of shifted things like jackpot, firefly, frisbee, kindling to being more topic specific, more specific. So they're really relevant in this text, but might not need a whole lot of teaching or exploration of the word. It might just be that we say frisbee. Oh, that's a toy that you throw that comes back, and that is a toy that you might play with. It doesn't really need a whole lot of teaching, a real big focus on, because the likelihood that they need to have work on a deep meaning of that vocabulary, it's limited. So my attempt here was to kind of prioritize the kinds of words, those tier 2 words that you might find would be really worth engaging some teaching time in, explicitly focusing on the meaning of those words. So having said that, if you have managed to bring a text with you, that's great. And can I just give you a couple of minutes to either, if you've got a novel with you, perhaps to just look at the opening paragraphs, to identify, or if you've got a picture book with you, perhaps to flick through the first couple of pages. Can you just identify some of those high frequency words that are in that text that you think are worth spending some teaching time focusing on for the meaning of the words, that are likely to help the children to be able to really understand not only the text that you're focusing on, but that then they could transfer that knowledge to other places? If I just give you a couple of minutes to do that, that would be great. Okay. I hope you brought a text. Otherwise, there's a bit of dead time for you, and apologies. what we'll do then is if you've got a small collection there, or even if you've thought of a word that you might focus on, what we'll do for the rest of the session is for some of the activities, just take a moment to give you a chance to think of it in terms of that particular word, so that if you are thinking of trying some of these activities in the coming days, you've done a little bit of the thinking ahead of time. So that selecting the words, choosing the words, and again for a text, it might be that it's just it might be, if you're working with a novel, that you might have 1 or 2 words for a chapter. If you're working with a picture book, it might be that you're just focusing on 1 word that goes alongside that picture book that you're going to be focusing on for a couple of days, that you want to do that explicit teaching around, so that by the time that the children have read that book, they've explored that book, they're really, really clear on the meaning of that particular word that you've chosen, and it helps them with the comprehension of the text. So having selected the word, it talks about then going on to explain the word. And this is the thing that both Estin and the Education Endowment Foundation talk about, that important role of the adult to explain the word to the children. So the idea would be that you introduce the word, so with some my turn, your turn. So for example, if I was to choose the word fumble from the text that we've just looked at there, we would do it with a fumble, your turn, fumble, fumble, so that the children are saying the words out loud by giving an accurate and a child-friendly definition. And I think this is really important. And in Bringing Words to Life, Beck and Kuchen et al. Really go to town on the importance of giving the children a definition of the word by using words that they already have, that they already know. And I think that sounds really obvious, but it's so important. And it's one of the reasons why, for many children, asking the children to find the word in a dictionary may be of limited support to them, because often the dictionary explanation obviously relies on them having the decoding ability to be able to read the definition, but sometimes the words that are used in the definition itself are not in the comprehension of the children. So one of the things that they would suggest is that a quick oral definition by you to help the children really know what that word means can be helpful. So for example, if I was introducing the word fumble, I might talk about it being a word that is about being, when someone's fumbling, they're being a bit clumsy with something, or they're using something in a clumsy way. Giving a simple, accurate, child-friendly definition. Might give a visual to support that, might with all children of all ages encourage them to act that out. So I might act that out, ask them to act that out, give them some examples from my experience that support their experience in context. I might model that on the board to write it out and draw attention to the features of the word graphically, and then encourage the children briefly to use that word themselves in their writing, even though we're talking particularly about that focus on the reading today. So broadly, that explain part is quite brief, with you directing and guiding the children through that. So as I say, if we were doing that with the word fumble, one of the things that it might be worth thinking about is, how do you go about giving that child-friendly definition rather than just directing children to a dictionary? So Beck talks about using phrases like, if something is this, then it means that, might be a way to help you to devise that child-friendly definition. Or when someone is fumbling, he or she might be being quite clumsy with something, or fumbling describes someone who is being clumsy when they're handling something or when they're going about something. So giving that child-friendly definition, really, really important, but often just needs a moment to think about in advance, so that I don't use any words with you that you don't know in the definition, if that makes sense. So can I give you just a moment, just 30 seconds to jot down? And if you want to put it in the chat, then that's fantastic. We can see the kinds of words that you're thinking about, or otherwise just on a bit of paper. What definition might you prepare to give to your children for one of the words on your list? Just for 30 seconds. Okay. As we're a nice small group, it's probably worth, oh, somebody's typing. I was just going to say, if you could give me an indication in the chat of if you have got a book with you, that would be great. This is not to say we should have brought a book, but if none of you have managed to get bring a book with you, I won't keep giving you time to think. Oh, there you are. If someone is hysterical, then they're very upset and making very loud crying noises. Really good. Fabulous. So you've got books with you. That's brilliant. If something is hurried, it means it's done quickly. Absolutely. Wonder. Yeah, that's a nice one. Okay. Fab. I'll just hang on for a couple of people typing. Thank you. Nice. Nice. Okay, fab. Again, it may seem, maybe I'm not as bright as you, but I think to try and find words that the children already know and understand in order to give that definition sometimes just does take a moment. So having to explain the word, to give the children a definition that's your definition that you're giving to them that's really user friendly. Another way of going about that kind of explain is to use pictures perhaps to help with that explanation. So for example, oh, do you know what? Our word is fumble. I've explained that it means to do something in a clumsy way or to be clumsy with something when you're handling something. I always feel really sorry for the goalkeeper when they fumble the ball and it ends up in the back of the net. That's terrible, isn't it? It heart bleeds for them. Ah, another one, you can see the picture there. Don't you just hate it when you've stood in a queue for an ice cream for ages, and then when you finally get hold of that ice cream cone and you fumble with the cone and it ends up on the floor, splat, and you've wasted all that time. Or something that I do quite a lot because I get up earlier than my husband is that in the morning I often spend ages fumbling about for the light switch on the landing because I don't want to wake him. So I'm fumbling about in the dark for the light switch. So using images to help give that definition, to give a context, something that's familiar with the children, so that you're giving a range of contexts that all give an example of the use of that particular vocabulary in the right way. You also, in that explain phase, particularly, I guess, if you're working with younger children and you're looking at simpler words, perhaps, you might want to make links with the phonics that they're working on. So, you know, if you work with sound buttons, you might want to provide the word with the sound buttons. You might want to do it with the phoneme frame, where how many phonemes does our word have? And fond. You might want to give them the word and so that they can see it and perhaps draw around the outline, so that graphic of the shape of the word helps them to just be able to see it and recognize the shape of the word, as much as we can do to engage all the senses to help them to engage with that particular word. There's nothing new here. One of I mentioned the word aware resources earlier, which again I'll mention later. One of the resources that they explore in their resource is they use something called their word wizard, which is a way of perhaps sharing with the children all of the things that we know about this new word, and they go through a particular process which I think is really useful, and I'll share the link with this for this, and I think it's in the slides anyway. So our new word is fumble. It begins with it rhymes with mumble. It has 2 syllables. Say the word to your partner. Say the word in a loud voice. Say the word in a whisper voice. So it might be that you want to have a think about having a really simple pro forma that you might use regularly with the children. This on a wall display would be great, or a simpler version that just helps to focus on the word that we're really focusing on, the word that we're really learning. And we're going to be word wizards by focusing on this word. I thought that was quite a nice little record. Just to take a moment to consider that depending on the age of the children that you're considering and the text that you're focusing on, it may be that you decide to either focus on exploring in depth the meaning of the word after you've come across it in the text, or you might decide that you want to focus on the meaning of the word in depth in advance of reading the text, so that when the children come across it in the text, they already have a really good knowledge and comprehension of that vocabulary in order to support their comprehension of that paragraph, that chapter, that text. And certainly from the things that I've read and considered, it seems to be the understanding that with younger children, it's more useful actually to read the text with the children, come across the word, and then focus on the knowledge of that word in depth after you've read the text with them. Whereas coming across for older children, doing that job before they come to the text, so that they already know the word in some depth. You've already explained the word to them and you've explored it a little bit before they come to the text, will work best for them to be able to then really see that word in the text and develop their comprehension that way. That, as far as I can see, there doesn't seem to be a best way. It would be very much about which you think would work best for you. The difficulty in trying to focus on the word whilst you're reading, so you come across the word fumble in the reading and then spend a bit of time with them at that moment explaining the word, and do we know what that word means? And sometimes that can really halt the enjoyment of the story. It can jeopardize their comprehension of the story so far and the plot. So to really explore the word in depth either before or after is probably the best way of going about it, which again is common sense. So in having explained the word to the children is providing those opportunities to explore the word in some depth so that the children get really familiar with the meaning of the word. So understanding it in their own words and having some strategies to help them remember that word, considering what kind of word it is, particularly with older children. What kind of word class is it? Is it a verb? Can it be used as an adjective? Can it be used as an adverb? And exploring the range of contexts that you might use that word. Thinking about different contexts that it might use that word for, the different ways that it's being used in a sentence. As we mentioned at the beginning, perhaps exploring it in a simple way, the etymology, the root of the word and where it comes from, as a way of helping the children to really understand the meaning of that word. Again, with pandiculate, knowing that pandere comes from the Latin and it means to stretch, might just help you to remember and understand the meaning of that word. And exploring other words that come from that same word family helps them to get a really deep understanding. So again, none of these new ideas, but just the range that you might draw on with particular words to help the children come to grips with it. So if we explore some suggestions for the kinds of short, sharp activities that you might do as part of your shared reading with your whole class, perhaps, or as part of some of guided reading, if there is vocabulary that you're going to be looking at in particular with a guided reading test. Here are some things that I've come across that I just thought are really simple, not much planning involved, but you could engage the children in for that exploration. So let's see how we get on. So sentence completion, really simple activity that you might do orally with your class. So use the sentence starter and find your own ending. So the boy fumbled with his Pokemon cards, and so can you with your partner or on a whiteboard finish that sentence. By finishing the sentence, obviously they have to have an understanding of fumbled. So can I give you just a moment? Can you finish that sentence in the chat for me? Oh, I love that we've got rhyme going on here. So the boy fumbled with his Pokemon cards, and so they fell out of his bag and onto the floor. The boy fumbled with his Pokemon cards, and so sadly they tumbled onto the floor. And so unfortunately they dropped all over the floor. Fab. You get the drift. Just that again, we do this a lot for writing, but even just orally to get at that, practicing to use the word in a context. I could have said Mrs. McMahon, the new teacher, fumbled with her pens because, and we could ask for that sentence completion. So either orally or as a writing task, just that little opportunity to explore the meaning of the word. Another really quick and easy one, which is right? Let's play which is right. What might you fumble with? Are you more likely to fumble with the keys in your hands or a car in a parking space? To your partner, which do you think? So again, we're trying to get to the fact that fumbling is about being clumsy with something in your hands, perhaps, or with something that you're handling or something that you're using. The likelihood that that's usually small things or things that you're moving and handling yourself. It wouldn't be relevant for something like if you were driving, you're not going to be fumbling a steering wheel. It just doesn't fit with the real knowledge of that word. So the which is right gives the children the opportunity to think about the real specifics of the word. Who is most likely to fumble? A parcel delivery lady or a man lying on a beach? Now, it was only last night when I woke up in the middle of the night that I thought with adults, you might infer something from this. But if we were talking with children, it's quite a straightforward answer. A parcel delivery lady we might be looking for because, and we might ask them to explain why in a full sentence. What might a parcel delivery lady fumble? So, I mean, you can see how these are just quite short, sharp, simple ways of just encouraging the children to explore the vocabulary in context. Another activity that comes from the Bringing Words to Life is just a simple activity, making choices. If any of the things I say are examples of fumbling, shout out fumble. If not, got to keep quiet. So imagine my class in front of me on the carpet or in the classroom, and I give them a sentence that they can't see. So struggling to get the key in the front door. Is that something where I might fumble or not? And the children are shouting out fumble. Throwing a football at your friend. You would expect the children to shout out fumble because yes, you can fumble a football. Moving through your bedroom in the dark, would you expect them to shout out? Yes, you would, because you might be fumbling about in the dark, and it might be an example. Alongside that, to give them some examples that you wouldn't be fumbling. So, for example, parking a bus. or giving some examples of things that aren't fumbling. So the anti to that. So three really simple oral activities that are just short, sharp with your class, children working in pairs, or with your guided reading group to explore the meaning of a word, sentence completion, which is right, making choices. Can I just give you a minute with your chosen word? Pick one or have a go at all three and give some of those examples that you might use if your class was in front of you. Okay, I'm aware that time is racing on, so I'm going to move along, safe in the knowledge that nothing that I'm telling you here is it's very complex. So, another thing that comes through the word aware resources, which I've stolen, having bought my own copy, so that I feel I'm allowed to do this a little bit. Perhaps thinking about the kinds of questions that you might pose for children to try and elicit them exploring and giving explanations and using the word that you're focusing on in a context. So, for example, if the word that you're focusing on, your selected word, is a verb, you might craft some questions around some of these things. You might get asked, craft a question around when might somebody do that verb, or what objects might be needed for that verb to be done. So an example with my word fumble, I might just so, for example, a question I might pose to my class that I might ask them to demonstrate their understanding: when might someone fumble with a set of keys? Or what might cause someone to fumble with a set of keys? Or what might happen if someone fumbled with a set of keys? What objects can you think of any object that a cook might fumble with in a kitchen? Can you think of three things that might be examples of fumbling that we might see in a classroom? So you get a flavour for some of the kinds of questions that you can easily adapt depending on whether something is a verb or a noun or an adjective, for example. And what I have, when you get the slide set as a PDF, which I'll drop into the chat at the end, you can see the link on the slide here takes you to a document that has an array of kind of sample questions that you can quite easily adapt if you're working with your children to try and do some of this explore work. It's just a useful resource. So again, again, with my example of fumble, using images is a really nice way of helping the children to get a feel for the context that the word might be used in, and using images is a really good way to do that. You can also use images as a way of exploring the range of different meanings that a word might have in different contexts. And it might be that you might give a selection of pictures and then provide a selection of prompts and questions for the children to consider in individually or as a class or in small groups. So, for example, here, if the vocabulary that I'm focusing on is perhaps flutter, which was another of the words from the picture book at the beginning, let's have a look at that first picture on the left-hand side, that landscape. What is fluttering here? Can you describe what is fluttering in this image and use a full sentence to do it? In the second picture at the bottom of the screen there, or sorry, in the top right, what part of the bird is fluttering? Can you describe what part of the bird is fluttering and how it is fluttering? And the third picture in the middle there, how would you use fluttering to describe this picture and use a full sentence? So images is a really good way of promoting the use of some of that language to try and draw that comprehension and expose the children to it. Or you might, having done that, perhaps some really nice oracy activities to embed this might be something like the odd one out activity, which is a lovely oracy task. So pairs of children or small groups or as a whole class, here are 3 images. They all have something in common. The word flutter could be used to describe the things in the picture. Can you think which you might say is the odd one out and describe why? And having done a massive amount of work recently with Voice 21 and developing children's oracy skills, you might give them some sentence stems to support that. So encourage them to use, I suggest that the middle picture is the odd one out because, or due to the fact that, and so on. Okay, I can see that time is moving on, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. Some of the other kinds of activities that you might use with the children to explore or to use to display when focusing on key vocabulary might be something like the Freya model. This is a very well used one for cross-curricular vocabulary as well. Those as well as those tier 2 words, and this is something called the Freya model, which you may have come across, where you provide a pupil-friendly definition, which we've already done, orally. You look at the characteristics of the word, and I'll give some examples in a minute. You might give it in a context of a sentence, and you might also give the children non-examples, so perhaps antonyms. So an example of that might be something like, again, from the picture book, the word rustle. Rustle is a very specific meaning. So you might give the definition to make a soft hissing sound, like something rubbing together. That might be rustling. It's often used to describe dry materials, dry things that are rubbing together and making that particular sound. In terms of characteristics, you might give a visual image to remind and to help with the understanding. You give some sentences, perhaps, that use that word effectively, and you might give some examples that really clearly describe what isn't rustling. So in this case, clanging is so different from rustling. Rustling is a soft, hissing, dry kind of sound, whereas clanging is hard and metallic and loud. So you can see that by using the Freya model, it just helps to remind, support, and might be a nice display to use with the children. Again, here's another one, airborne, where slightly different in this case, in that still got a visual image, nice simple definition. And the thing about these definitions is they're often quite wordy because they're not about being brief and concise, as is the case in a dictionary, but it's about giving that really rounded, detailed explanation that the children are really then clear about that definition. And in this case, we've given non-examples that are simple sentences rather than just an individual word. And I won't give this to you now, but again, in the PDF, you'll have an example of a blank version if you think that's something that you might want to use with the children. It's quite a nice one to use. I've included, if you are working at the top end of school, there's a really nice set of slides that I came across that are all of the vocabulary that you might want to pick and choose from with the picture, with the novel The Explorer, which I highly recommend. It's a fantastic read, and the resources there on the slide for you. So exploring synonyms, words that have a similar meaning, and I think it's important to use that word similar, not the same, because we want, particularly as children go through the school, to know that there are nuances between words that are similar, but often to know the really deep meaning of a word helps them to be able to know how that word is different from other words that are similar. And it's the kind of activity that we probably do higher up through the school, where we might explore something like a word climb, where you're looking at words that are progressively, they might be similar, or that might be on a kind of sliding scale of intensity. So in this word climb, words to describe pain is this example. So, you know, the word intense, it's a very different meaning from a word that is like troublesome. And knowing the real in-depth meaning of those words will be important for children, so that they don't use them in an interchangeable way, so that they understand that meaning. You know, shades of meaning is something that's well used by children when they're looking at words that have similar meaning, but it's really important that they know in detail the meaning of the word. Excruciating, that's very different from something that's just unpleasant. So they might be similar in terms of they're talking about pain, but that meaning, knowing that in depth, is important. And when in the Estin report it talked about that, looking at those characteristics of words and showing that interest and exploring, being able to look at morphology and parts of words. So looking at a word like disconnect, it's important that you know that that prefix dis it has a really important part in us really understanding the word disconnect. So that part of the word, that prefix, actually means not. So disconnect is very different from connect, and the meaning is helped by knowing about the prefix. It's also helped by the etymology of that root to the word connect. And again, in most, my recommendation would be to buy and have in the staff room an etymological dictionary, which is about the meanings of words and the etymology of words. It'd be a good investment, but you can find these things online as well. So if you're exploring and learning the word connect or disconnect, to know that the Latin for con comes from the word together, and nect comes from nectar, from the Latin nectar, which means to bind. And again, just by exploring that with the children helps them to really understand the deep meaning of the word connect, that means binding together, connecting, and what that means. It all helps. It's all part of that richness. Okay, I can see that I'm rapidly running out of time here, so I'm going to move on quickly. So all of these things are about those short, sharp opportunities for, once that you've explained the word, for the children to explore the word in their own context, and those times over time to keep coming back to that word, so that it starts to move from that short-term memory into the long-term memory. And this is a word then that the children know, and it's part then of that reading repertoire that they have. So it's coming back to over time, using in context over time. So for example, in the word aware, they talk about having in theirs that they have a word pot. All right, perhaps a section of a display board where you might display words that have used previously, or in this case, it's an actual pot where when you focused on the word scamper, it goes into the word pot. When you focused on the word flutter, it goes into the word pot. And then at various times over the coming weeks, you can, when you have a few moments, dip into your word pot, pull out a word, and perhaps do some of those sentence completion, or asking the children to turn to each other and come up with a sentence using that word. Those kinds of consolidation activities. So having done it a couple of weeks ago, you're coming back to it and dropping it in over time, which is a really nice way, as I say, of just keeping it in that working memory to the long-term memory. Again, other activities that do that, just that little oracy game of guess what. So one of the children comes to the front of the classroom, they have a picture card, perhaps of the flag with the word flutter on, and their task is to try and describe what's on the picture without using the word flutter for the children to guess. And it's just keeping that word in their minds. Even better by playing taboo with a word card in front of you. So I have the taboo card in front of me. I'm trying to get my friends to guess the word flutter, but I can't, when I'm describing to them, I can't use the word flap or flag or wings. And so I have to use and describe and find a way of getting the children to guess at that mystery word flutter. And again, it's just those techniques of many that you'll have many of trying to keep coming back and and consolidating the meaning of that word. And let's not forget that if you are reading text in guided reading or in shared reading subsequently, where one of those keywords comes up, you would undoubtedly want to focus some of that comprehension questioning on, can you find the word in the text that means this? Can you find can you find any words in the text that suggest a character is this, that, or the other, that requires them to really understand that word? So focusing on questioning for comprehension. And at the bottom of this slide is a resource that is my go-to resource when I'm doing guided reading with question stems to support you thinking on your feet when you want to focus on vocabulary as part of the Vipers. Oh, okay, I'm going to move on. Something that again I came across on Twitter that again I think particularly if you're working with older students that you might want to engage with. This was a teacher who had a magpie word collection that the children had in their books, at the back of their books, in their reading response books, maybe even just a wall display where you're recording words that you are explicitly teaching, so that over time you can keep coming back to them and recalling them and developing that knowledge of them. And again, in the slide set is an example of a Word document that you can use and adapt if it's useful. That might save you 2 minutes. Just not a word of warning, but a word of caution. And again, I've mentioned it earlier. Beck et al. in their seminal work talk about being careful with the dictionary, that the best case scenario is that you describe meanings and definitions of words using a language that the children are already really comfortable and familiar with, so that they can really get at the meaning of a word. And just to be careful that by directing children to find out the meanings of words independently doesn't always necessarily mean that they're going to end up with a really good, deep knowledge, number 4 on the scale of understanding that word and comprehending that word fully. So it's just a word of caution, really. So quickly talked about the 3 pillars. This session has been very much on sort of basic techniques around explicit vocabulary teaching and not so much on the incidental and that word consciousness. Although if you focus on morphology and etymology, you are very definitely in the realms of that word consciousness. If they're of any use to you, there's nothing better for engaging children in being interested in words and developing that word knowledge than that breadth of reading for pleasure. And I've just included on the last couple of pages here some excellent resources to support you if you are focusing on reading for pleasure in your school. And again, we haven't got time to look at those in detail. If you are particularly interested in how to develop vocabulary with regards to Welsh, with regards to well-being, or if you're particularly interested in finding out more about the word aware, at the bottom of this slide page in your PDF is a link to a set of resources and information about the Working with Words professional learning series that we held last year. masses of videos, slides and information about with practice from across the wellbeing team and the Welsh team in the EAS with vocabulary tips across the curriculum. And there's lots of materials there that you might want to go to and explore. Okay, I'm going to leave that there. David Crystal, an education guru, if ever there was one, said, education is the process of preparing us for the big world, and the big world has big words. The more big words you know, the better you'll survive in it, because there are hundreds of thousands of words in English. You can't learn them all, but this doesn't mean we shouldn't try and learn some. And I think what that explicit teaching is about identifying, picking off those words that you can learn well, that the children will come across a range of contexts and be better readers for it. So having said all of that and having run over, I hugely apologise. Can I ask you to just take a moment perhaps to reflect on, is there anything you're going to have to go away and think about from today? Anything you're going to go and talk to somebody else about in school? Anything you think, actually, I'm just going to have a go at that myself? Or any of the resources that we've mentioned that you think you might have to share with others? And having thought about that, as you're doing that, I'll just make sure that I put the PDF into the what's the word I'm looking for? Middle-aged woman chat for you. And if I could encourage you to just take a moment to complete a very brief feedback for me. I'll put that in the link as well. So I've popped that in the chat, just a brief feedback form. You can either scan it with your phone for a QR code, but if I could just ask you to take a moment to do that for me, and I'll put the PDF in for you.
Thank you, Catherine. I've lost your sound for some reason.